The morning rush at JFK Airport moved with choreographed chaos, clicking heels, rolling suitcases, and the low murmur of travel-weary voices. Amid the tide of passengers navigating terminal gates and coffee lines stood Grace Wellington, dressed in a modest black sweater, well-fitted jeans, and the kind of walking shoes chosen for practicality, not fashion. Her blonde hair was tied into a ponytail, her face free of makeup, and the only jewelry she wore was a simple gold wedding band. She looked like any other traveler, ordinary, quiet, focused. But Grace wasn't just any traveler. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who had flown all her life, someone who had lost count of the boarding passes and security checks. Today was meant to be easy. Her husband, Edward Sinclair, was already in San Francisco finalizing a business deal, and she was flying out to join him for a long-awaited vacation, their first in nearly a year. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the terminal as Grace approached the Atlantic Airways first-class counter, ticket and ID in hand. A digital sign above her blinked, Flight 177, San Francisco on time. At the check-in podium stood a woman in her mid-30s, impeccably dressed in a crisp navy uniform. Her name tag read, Veronica Palmer. Her hair was styled to perfection, makeup airbrushed smooth. She wore confidence like armor and condescension like perfume. Grace offered a pleasant smile and handed over her documents. "Good morning. Flight 177 to San Francisco, first class." Veronica's eyes skimmed Grace's outfit, pausing on the shoes, the sweater, the lack of brand labels. Something flickered behind her eyes. Disbelief, maybe, or quiet disdain. "And how did you obtain this ticket, ma'am?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Grace blinked, caught off guard by the question. "My husband booked it for me." "I see." Veronica's tone was professional but sharp, like someone biting back something less polite. Her long acrylic nails clacked against the keyboard as she began typing. "There seems to be an issue with your reservation." Grace kept her voice calm. "There shouldn't be. Edward confirmed the details yesterday." Veronica's lips pressed into a thin line. "This ticket lists a first-class seat, but I'm not seeing the correct corporate code on your file. Do you have the credit card it was purchased with?" "No," Grace said, trying to suppress her growing irritation. "My husband used his corporate account." Veronica's expression stiffened. "We have strict standards for first-class passengers." "There may have been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Grace replied evenly. "That is a confirmed first-class ticket." The line behind her was growing. Two sharply dressed businessmen had stepped in behind her and were now watching the exchange with quiet interest. Veronica lowered her voice. "Our first-class experience is tailored for premium clientele. We expect a certain level of—" She paused, eyes flicking down to Grace's shoes again. "Presentation." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me. I can offer you an economy seat," Veronica continued, her tone suggesting this was a generous offer. "Same destination, just a different arrangement." "That won't be necessary," Grace said, her spine straightening. "My ticket is for first class, that's what I paid for, and that's where I'll be sitting." Veronica's smile vanished completely. "Ma'am, I don't appreciate your tone. Would you prefer to speak with my supervisor?" "Yes," Grace said. "I think that would be best." Veronica picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Richard, we have a situation at counter 3. She hung up and looked smugly satisfied. "Mr. Hargrove will be with you shortly." Grace checked the time, 2 hours until departure. Plenty of time, but the situation was spiraling fast and she knew how this kind of condescension could escalate. Within moments, Richard Hargrove arrived, a tall, silver-haired man in a navy suit, polished shoes gleaming. His lapel bore the gold pin of a senior staff member. His voice was calm but cool as he addressed Veronica. "What's the issue?" Before Veronica could reply, Grace stepped in. "There's no issue. Your employee is questioning the legitimacy of my first-class ticket based on how I look." Hargrove turned to study Grace, her clothing, her posture, then looked at the ticket. His corporate mask didn't slip, but something in his eyes did. "Mrs. Wellington," Grace said. "Mrs. Wellington," Hargrove said smoothly. "I understand your frustration, but we have protocols." Veronica was simply following them. "What protocol involves questioning a confirmed ticket?" Grace asked. We've had irregularities, Hargrove said. People attempting unauthorized upgrades, or using tickets acquired through unconventional means. Grace's voice grew sharper. Are you suggesting I stole the ticket? Not at all, Hargrove backpedaled. It could be a system error. It happens. Grace had heard enough. I've been standing here for 15 minutes. Either verify my reservation or let me speak with someone who can. Veronica and Hargrove exchanged a look. I'm afraid we'll need additional verification, Hargrove said. Perhaps you can call your husband to confirm the booking. Grace exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. The reservation is valid. What more do you need? Hargrove's mask slipped slightly. Mrs. Wellington, your attitude isn't helping. If you can't verify it, I'll have to ask you to step aside. I'm not moving, Grace said firmly. Not until you honor the ticket. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He turned to a nearby officer. Security. A uniformed man approached, hand resting on his belt. Officer Miller. His badge read. Is there a problem? He asked. This passenger is refusing to comply with our verification procedures, Hargrove said. We may need to escort her to the main terminal. Grace felt her face flush. I have a valid first-class ticket. They're refusing to honor it because of how I'm dressed. Officer Miller looked uneasy but said nothing. Veronica smirked as she resumed calling the next passenger forward with a cheery, I can help whoever's next. Grace had had enough. She stepped aside, pulled out her phone, and found Edward's name in her contacts. Time to let them see who exactly they were humiliating. As the phone began to ring, Grace's voice was steady. Edward, they're refusing to let me board. Grace held the phone to her ear, her posture calm, her tone unwavering. Edward, they're refusing to let me board. A breath of silence passed. Then Edward Sinclair's voice came through, warm at first but clipped with concern. Grace, what do you mean they're refusing? Aren't you already through security? No, she replied quietly, glancing toward the counter. They're demanding I provide additional verification for a first-class ticket, suggesting I take an economy seat instead. Edward's tone changed immediately firmer, more focused. Did you tell them who you are? No, she said, eyes still fixed on Veronica's satisfied expression, and I shouldn't have to. You're right, Edward replied. A beat of silence followed. Then, in a voice she hadn't heard in months, the one that used to silence boardrooms and freeze million-dollar negotiations, he said, Put me on speaker. Edward, now, Grace. She sighed, tapped the speaker icon, and turned the phone outward. You're on speaker. Go ahead. Hargrove, who had turned away, glanced back with faint interest. He clearly assumed Grace was bluffing, that this was an act of desperation, a call to a friend, perhaps, or a powerless spouse hoping to save face. Edward's voice filled the terminal with effortless authority. Who am I speaking with? Hargrove stepped closer, that corporate smile slipping slightly. This is Richard Hargrove, supervisor at Atlantic Airways, JFK Terminal. May I ask who I'm addressing? Edward Sinclair, came the reply, CEO of Sinclair Global Investments. Majority shareholder of Pinnacle Holdings, which, as you should know, acquired a controlling interest in your parent company last year. Hargrove's face drained of color. Behind the counter, Veronica Palmer froze mid-keystroke. Even Officer Miller took a small step back, suddenly fascinated with a security pamphlet on the wall. Mr. Sinclair, Hargrove said, his voice now trembling, there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Edward said, his voice ablade. My wife showed you a valid ticket. You chose to humiliate her because she wasn't dressed to your standards. Is that correct? The terminal had fallen nearly silent. People had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the businessmen from earlier were standing with arms folded, watching like spectators at a trial. Sir, we have policies. Don't insult me with policies, Edward interrupted. I know every single policy your airline enforces. I fly over 200,000 miles with you every year. What you've done is discrimination, plain and simple. A woman in line whispered to her companion, Sinclair. Is he talking about the Sinclair? Veronica slowly backed away from the desk, trying to look busy. Hargrove was sweating now, visibly shaken. "Mr. Sinclair, I deeply apologize. Please allow me to personally escort Mrs. Wellington to the Celestial Lounge." "I'm not interested in apologies, Mr. Hargrove," Edward snapped. "I want your regional director. Now, she is not on site at the moment." "Find her." Hargrove fumbled for his phone. Across the counter, the staff exchanged urgent whispers. One employee began typing rapidly into a tablet. The momentum had completely shifted. While Hargrove texted furiously, Edward's voice remained calm and clear over the speaker. "Grace, tell me everything that happened." She looked at Hargrove. "When I handed over my ticket, Veronica immediately questioned how I obtained it. Implied I didn't belong in first class. When I pushed back, Mr. Hargrove got involved and insisted I provide proof or step aside. Then he called security." The crowd murmured again. Veronica stood motionless, her face ashen. Officer Miller took another step back, clearly wanting no part in the growing firestorm. "I see," Edward said. "Mr. Hargrove, do you deny this?" There was confusion regarding verification. "Did you or did you not question my wife's right to board because of how she appeared?" The silence was deafening. I sincerely apologize." "That's not an answer." Hargrove looked completely undone. "Yes, I mean there was an assumption that perhaps the ticket was in error." A trim woman in a charcoal skirt suit and low heels came striding quickly toward them. Her name tag read, Victoria Thompson, Regional Director. Her face was composed, but her eyes blazed with urgency. "Mr. Sinclair?" she asked, taking the phone from Hargrove. "This is Victoria Thompson. I just received the alert and came immediately." "Good," Edward replied, "because I want to know what you're going to do about this. We will be investigating the matter thoroughly. Mrs. Wellington will receive our highest-level service. I'll personally escort her to the lounge." "That's not enough," Edward said coldly. "I want accountability, effective immediately." Thompson took a breath, then nodded. "Mr. Hargrove and Miss Palmer will be placed on administrative leave pending full investigation." Veronica let out a choked gasp. Hargrove opened his mouth to protest, but Thompson silenced him with a single glare. "We'll also have our CEO contact you directly today," she added, "to discuss how we can make this right." Grace remained silent, letting the scene play out. The same people who had humiliated her minutes ago were now bending backward to appease her because of who her husband was. "Grace," Edward said gently now, "are you satisfied with that?" For the moment, Grace considered for a beat, then looked directly at Thompson. "No, I want something more." "Name it," Thompson said quickly. "I want a written apology, delivered to every passenger who witnessed this incident, acknowledging the discrimination, and outlining what your airline will do to address it." Thompson looked stunned but recovered quickly. "Yes, we can arrange that." Behind them, a quiet murmur of approval rose. One elderly man nodded in support. Even the businessmen from before looked visibly impressed. Edward's voice returned. "My wife's wishes will be met to the letter, Miss Thompson. And I'll be expecting that CEO call. Don't disappoint me twice in one day." "Yes, sir," Thompson said, still holding the phone like a lifeline. As the call ended, Victoria turned to Grace and extended her hand. "Mrs. Wellington, if you'll allow me." Grace nodded, following her away from the counter as Officer Miller gave her a respectful nod. Behind them, Hargrove and Veronica were being quietly led toward the administrative offices, their careers unraveling before the entire terminal. But Grace didn't look back. She had a flight to catch and a point well made. The Celestial Lounge lived up to its name. Frosted glass doors slid open silently as Grace entered, escorted by Victoria Thompson herself. Inside, the din of the airport vanished, replaced by the soft hum of ambient music and the clink of fine glassware. Plush chairs, sleek marble counters, and elegant lighting greeted her, everything carefully curated to exude exclusivity and serenity. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Victoria said, her voice tight with professional effort. "I've informed the lounge staff of your arrival. Anything you need, just say the word." Grace offered a polite nod but said nothing. Her thoughts were still back at the terminal counter, where a woman had judged her unworthy of a seat based on nothing but her appearance. Veronica Palmer's perfect makeup and controlled smile had tried to deny her dignity. And Richard Hargrove, with all his manufactured authority, had backed her without hesitation. Grace wasn't angry anymore. That feeling had passed the moment Edward's voice sliced through the chaos. What she felt now was something colder, sharper, clarity. A well-dressed server approached almost immediately. "Mrs. Wellington, welcome to the Celestial Lounge. I'm Michael, and I'll be personally assisting you today. May I offer you something to drink?" "Just water, thank you," Grace replied. He returned moments later with a crystal glass on a silver tray, bowing slightly as he placed it before her. Victoria remained standing, hands clasped tightly. "Mrs. Wellington," she began, lowering her voice, "I want to assure you that what happened outside is being addressed at the highest levels." Grace sipped the water and tilted her head slightly, saying nothing. "We are initiating a full internal review," Victoria continued. "By the time you land in San Francisco, significant disciplinary and procedural changes will have been set in motion." Grace finally spoke. "Good." Victoria took that as a cue to continue. "This incident is not representative of our values, and it will serve as a wake-up call throughout our organization." Grace met her eyes. "This isn't about your values, Miss Thompson. It's about your culture." "There's a difference." Victoria hesitated. "How many other passengers," Grace went on, her voice quiet but pointed, "don't have billionaire husbands to make phone calls for them? What happens to them when someone like Veronica decides they don't look the part?" The regional director looked momentarily ashamed. "Your point is well taken." Grace leaned back in the chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Then make sure the apology I requested includes that point." "Yes, ma'am," Victoria said. As she turned to leave, Grace's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up to find a message from Edward. "How are you really feeling?" She smiled faintly, tapping out a reply. "Like I just witnessed a corporate earthquake. You should have seen their faces." A reply came seconds later. "I'd rather see yours." 6 hours. "I'll be waiting." For the next few hours, Grace remained in the lounge, undisturbed. The few other first-class passengers who had also been watching the morning's drama now cast furtive glances her way. She could sense them trying to match her face to a name. Searching their phones, whispering. Nobody approached her. She preferred it that way. At boarding time, Michael reappeared. "Mrs. Wellington, the captain has requested to personally welcome you aboard. Would you like to meet him now?" Grace shook her head gently. "That won't be necessary. I'd prefer to board like everyone else." The server's eyes widened slightly as such requests were rare in this realm of catered prestige. "Of course, as you wish." Grace gathered her bag, thanked the staff, and walked to the gate without fanfare. No special escort, no announcements, no velvet rope. Just a woman holding a valid ticket, walking with the certainty she had earned long ago, one that no uniform or condescending smile could take from her again. 6 hours later, her plane touched down at San Francisco International. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is to 14 p.m., clear skies and a pleasant 72 degrees. On behalf of Atlantic Airways, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today, especially Mrs. Grace Wellington Sinclair. It's been our honor to serve you." Grace closed her eyes briefly and sighed. The announcement wasn't necessary. It was more of the same overcorrection, apologies wrapped in performance. As she stepped into the jet bridge, she was surprised to find not only Edward waiting, but also a sharply dressed man in a gray tailored suit. His badge read, "James Hutchinson, CEO, Atlantic Airways." He looked nervous. "Mrs. Wellington," Hutchinson said, offering his hand. "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what you experienced this morning." Grace shook his hand lightly, her expression neutral. "I appreciate your concern." Edward stepped forward and wrapped an arm around her waist. His kiss on her cheek was gentle, but his eyes were sharp as they met Hutchinson's. "James and I have had a productive conversation," Edward said. "Atlantic Airways will be implementing new mandatory training programs on identifying and eliminating bias in customer service. Isn't that right, James?" Hutchinson nodded quickly. "Yes, and more. We're also revamping our complaint protocols and establishing a third-party review board to handle future discrimination claims. Grace raised an eyebrow over jeans and walking shoes. Edward's reply was quiet but firm, over arrogance. Over assuming that appearances define value. Outside the terminal, a sleek black town car waited. As they settled into the back seat, Grace let herself lean into Edward's shoulder. "You know what the strangest part is," she murmured. "If they had just treated me like anyone else, this would have been just another boring airport story." Edward kissed the top of her head, and because they didn't, it became a lesson they'll never forget. In that plush leather seat, Grace finally let the day settle into memory. They hadn't just doubted her ticket, they doubted her. But she'd made sure they never would again. 2 days later, Grace stood barefoot in her kitchen, swirling honey into her tea. She had returned home from San Francisco not with the satisfaction of vengeance, but with a quiet heaviness that lingered behind her every step. The headlines had followed her. Social media had clipped the video of her confrontation. Her phone buzzed endlessly with messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some wanted interviews, others wanted to apologize for things they hadn't even said, and many strangers just wanted to thank her. But Grace hadn't done it for applause. She had made one phone call. The credit belonged not to her, she thought, but to Edward's name, Edward's voice, Edward's reach. What would have happened if she hadn't had that kind of backup? Would she have been escorted from the terminal? Would anyone have cared? Her phone buzzed again. Another reporter. She ignored it. Instead, she turned her attention to the news, where a breaking segment featured the CEO of Atlantic Airways making a public statement. "We are implementing internal reforms, diversity and bias training, and strengthening our oversight procedures. What happened at JFK was unacceptable. We thank Mrs. Grace Wellington Sinclair for her grace and her courage." Grace smirked at the unintended pun, but courage, she hadn't felt brave. She had felt cornered, humiliated, then rescued. And now, she wasn't so sure what she felt. That afternoon, Grace walked into her favorite corner cafe. She wore the same jeans, the same sweater she had worn at JFK, the same walking shoes. No makeup, hair in a bun. People stared. Not everyone but enough. Recognition hung in the air like the aroma of espresso. One man muttered to his companion, "That's the woman from the airport video." A young woman at a nearby table smiled at her and whispered, "Good for you." As Grace passed, she simply nodded and ordered her tea. At a small table near the window, she sat down with her drink and her thoughts, staring out at the sidewalk and the traffic and the ordinary day. It had been a long time since she felt invisible, and oddly enough, she missed it. Fame had come knocking on her door not because of what she did but because she had power behind her. But what of the others? What of the single mother flying coach for a funeral? What of the elderly man with a cane, denied a better seat because his jacket had holes? What of the girl in a hoodie who paid cash and got a second look instead of a second chance? She pulled out a notebook and began writing. Not a statement, not a complaint, just thoughts, she scribbled. "We treat people based on patterns. Clothing becomes a flag, voice becomes currency. And assumptions are made in seconds, but assumptions can cost jobs, dignity, peace. What if the gatekeepers started with kindness instead?" She stopped, tapped her pen on the edge of the table. Then wrote, "They didn't see me because I wasn't trying to be seen. But I saw them clearly, and I remember everything." That evening, Grace and Edward sat on the back patio, a light breeze curling through the hedges. He was reading through quarterly reports. She was sipping her tea again. "You're quiet," he said, glancing up. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About how easy it was to fix everything once your name got involved," she said, "and how terrifying that is." Edward closed the folder and set it aside. "Terrifying how?" "I had to borrow your voice to be treated with respect," Grace said softly. "That doesn't feel like justice. It feels like a warning." Edward studied her. "You were discriminated against, Grace. I had the power to do something about it. That's not wrong." "It's not wrong," she agreed, "but it shouldn't have been necessary." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You want to do something more?" "I do," she said. "I don't want to be remembered as the woman with the rich husband who made heads roll at an airport." Edward gave a small smile. "Then what do you want?" "I want to make sure that no one else has to be humiliated in public to get treated like a person." She held up her notebook. "I've been writing." "What is it?" "Just ideas, about bias, about systemic training, about patterns in customer-facing industries. Maybe I'll send it to Atlantic Airways. Maybe I'll publish it. I don't know. But I can't sit on this." Edward nodded. "Then I'll support whatever you decide." She looked at him. "No more phone calls. No more threats. If I do this, I do it as me." His answer came without hesitation. "Then that's who you'll be." By the end of the week, Grace submitted an open letter to the Atlantic, titled, "You Couldn't Tell Who I Was and That's the Problem." In it, she detailed her experience without naming names. She wrote about implicit bias, power dynamics, and the danger of dressing dignity in designer expectations. The article exploded across platforms. Millions read it. Thousands shared it. The comments were a flood of agreement, stories, confessions, and gratitude, from a black woman who had been mistaken for a nanny when traveling with her biracial children. From a young man with tattoos who was ignored while boarding business class. From an elderly couple who had been passed over for upgrades again and again. Grace had touched a nerve, not because of who she was, but because she had said what others had lived. One morning, she received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mrs. Wellington, thank you. I was in line that day. I saw it all. I didn't say anything because I didn't think it would matter. But your courage made me realize silence isn't neutral. Next time, I'll speak. A fellow passenger." Grace folded the note gently and placed it into her notebook. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She needed only this: that someone saw what had happened and chose never to let it happen again. San Francisco, morning. The Pacific sun streamed through the hotel window, golden and steady, wrapping Grace in warmth as she sipped her tea and read through the newest set of messages that had come in overnight. The letter had made waves, not just in the airline industry, but far beyond it. University professors were teaching it in seminars on ethics. Corporations were distributing it in diversity training packets. And individuals, people from every imaginable background, had written to her, thanking her for saying aloud what they had carried quietly for years. Grace didn't feel like a celebrity. She didn't feel powerful. She felt steady, grounded, seen. And for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand the weight of her own name, not because it was followed by Sinclair, not because it was tied to corporate clout or private jets, but because she had chosen to give it meaning. Edward appeared in the doorway, freshly showered, his shirt sleeves still unbuttoned. "Press wants to talk to you again," he said, raising an eyebrow. 3 national morning shows this time. Grace set her phone down. "Let them wait. I've said what I needed to." He nodded, crossing the room to kiss her forehead. "You've changed the conversation. You know that, right?" "I didn't want to change it," she said. "I just wanted it to exist, out in the open." Later that afternoon, Grace visited a nearby nonprofit that worked with underrepresented travelers, people with disabilities, immigrants, those struggling with language barriers, providing legal help and advocacy for those mistreated during flights and check-ins. The executive director, a middle-aged woman named Clara who wore passion like armor, greeted her with open arms. "Grace, you don't know what you've done." Grace shook her head. "I only wrote the truth." That's exactly why it mattered. They toured the space, met volunteers, reviewed case files. Grace listened to story after story, people who had been asked to move because of their race, denied services because of their accent, pulled aside for extra screening for reasons no one could explain. One case involved a refugee mother and her teenage son, separated for hours because a gate agent didn't believe they were related. Grace felt fury rise again, but this time, she had a purpose for it. She turned to Carla. "What do you need?" Carla hesitated. "Funding, policy support, legal assistance, awareness." Grace smiled. "Then let's get to work." That night, she and Edward hosted a quiet dinner, no photographers, no press, no gala gowns. Just a round table, a dozen advocates, and a stack of new ideas. They talked late into the evening about legislation that could be proposed, partnerships with airlines, open reporting tools. Grace listened more than she spoke. She was still learning. Still building the new version of herself, one not defined by who she married, but by what she stood for. Later, as they walked back to their suite, Edward reached for her hand. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" he asked gently. Grace glanced at him. "Do you mean this, or speaking out?" "Both," he said. "You're becoming a symbol. That kind of attention doesn't fade quickly." "I don't want it to fade," she said. "Not until it's no longer needed." He kissed the back of her hand. "Then I'll be beside you the whole way." Weeks passed, then months. Grace continued to advocate, quietly and consistently. She worked with advocacy groups, consulted for companies reevaluating their customer protocols, and even helped start a small initiative to train airline employees in implicit bias and compassionate communication. She didn't seek the limelight, but the spotlight followed her. She testified at a Senate hearing on travel discrimination. She was invited to speak at conferences, not as a billionaire's wife, but as an advocate, a voice, a woman who had walked through fire calmly and with purpose. And always, she came back to her mantra. True class is not about what you wear. It's about how you treat others. A year after the JFK incident, Grace walked into an airport again, this time at LAX. Same shoes, same sweater, same ticket. A young woman at the first-class counter looked up and smiled warmly. Her name tag read, Maya. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wellington. Welcome to Atlantic Airways. May I take your bag?" Grace handed it over. No pause, no hesitation. Just kindness. Maya glanced up again. "I wanted to say, your letter. It changed things, for me, for a lot of us." Grace smiled gently. "Thank you." Maya leaned in slightly. "We're trained differently now. We're aware now. Some of us didn't even realize how we'd been seeing people." Grace nodded. "Awareness is a good place to start." As she boarded the plane, no announcement was made. No grand welcome, no staff lineup, and she liked it that way. She found her seat, buckled in, and stared out the window as the sun dipped behind the runway lights. This was what she had wanted all along. Not special treatment, not revenge. Just fairness, just grace. In time, Grace Wellington Sinclair would be known less for the airport incident and more for the work that followed. Her foundation, Gateways, would become a national model for equity in travel. Her quiet power, her unshakable dignity, her refusal to let discrimination pass and challenge those would become her legacy. And every time she boarded a plane, she carried with her not just a ticket, but a message that rippled far beyond the boarding gate. You never know who you're looking at. So treat everyone like they matter, because they do.